Hey, aloha, and welcome to another exciting edition of Stan the Energy Man. Stan Osserman here, coming to you live and direct from my beautiful downtown Kailua studio in a subdivision of Olamana with all my memorabilia from being in the military in the background. Hope you appreciate it. Spent big bucks on this. Anyway, today's show's a little bit different. I'm going to start it off a little bit different anyway. I don't know if you've been kind of saturated or oversaturated or maybe inundated with a lot of the stuff going on TV with the news and reporting and riots and peaceful protests and everything in between. But I've kind of gotten a new um, angst for the term expert. So I wanted to convey a little story to you that it's actually a true story. Um, and you'll never hear me call myself an expert. And this story will explain why, even though a lot of times people refer to me as an energy expert or whatever. But I'd like to just impart this on you. And if you're like me, even just hearing the story is going to have a long lasting impact on you. But many years ago, I attended a symposium with an impressive group of presenters. I believe it was a military symposium on military support to civil authorities, but really a high ranking group of impressive folks giving this talk. And the host introduced the keynote speaker, and she emphasized his impressive academic credentials, his many years of practical experience, and finally, the many honors he'd received from his peers. She emphasized that the speaker was truly an expert in his field, and the audience welcomed him to the podium with thunderous applause. As the distinguished speaker quietly opened his notes and began to address the audience, he seemed a little apprehensive. He thanked the host for the generous introduction, but then quickly followed up with the comment, "I really don't like being referred to as an expert." This kind of explained his awkward hesitation as he opened his binder to give his speech. And so, before looking at his text, he took a few minutes to explain his disdain for the word expert. He started by sharing that he felt the word expert was generously applied to many people who were not experts at all and were even malicious, and sometimes gravely malicious. He explained that he had been misquoted many times as an expert, taking his words out of context, and he had to fight terribly hard to regain his credibility and his reputation. This was really troubling to him. He told the audience that the word itself did not depart any special wisdom, but instead literally described how useless the term expert really was. He said expert is a two-syllable adjective, a word modifying a noun. And the first syllable, ex, describes something in the past. It's past tense, something that formerly happened, something that was no longer even relevant. And the second syllable, spurt, was defined in the dictionary as the ejection of a fluid under pressure for a short duration. The example the dictionary gave for the word spurt was ejaculation. This certainly got the audience's attention. So he wanted to say an expert, in his view, was a former ejaculation. This precipitated a few murmurs and quite a few giggles from the audience, but he was quite serious, and he explained that as a biological fact, not only he, but everybody in the auditorium was a product of a former ejaculation, and that made him no different than everyone else in the entire auditorium. By this time, there were chuckles, and the mood of the auditorium became a little lighter. He was obviously being a little facetious, but he was also deadly serious, that we have a habit of taking idiots too seriously. So that's why you never hear me, Stan the Energy Man, claim to be an expert on clean energy. But more importantly, that's why we really need to look at the big talking heads on TV, the famous people on Facebook and Twitter, and ask ourselves, why should we give this person's opinion any credibility? This person, particularly critical today in our world, faces multiple challenges as far as too many factions and hidden political agendas are embedded in their quote unquote expert advice. And unfortunately, I think even some dark and dangerous agendas are embedded in some of this expert advice. If your mom was like mine, she probably warned you severely at some point in your young life that if all your friends wanted you to do something stupid, would you just go ahead and do it? And that's just a mom's way of saying, don't listen to experts. maybe it's time to listen to mom. So that's my thought on experts and how it applies in today's society. And those words and the introduction that presenter made has stuck with me for, it's probably been 25 years now. And quite frankly, every time I hear the word expert, you know what I'm thinking, and it's not good. So I'll leave it at that and get to what I really wanted to talk about today, and that's hydrogen news from around the world. This morning, bright and early, I wasn't able to attend, but an event happened that was probably groundbreaking in many ways. The European Union, and specifically some folks from Germany, held a live worldwide question and answer period talking about hydrogen energy storage and hydrogen. This thing occurred at about 4 in the morning Hawaii time and went on for several hours. And it was recorded, and I was hoping to get the recording and watching it before the show. Unfortunately, it wasn't available, but when I get a chance to look at it, and I'll look at it in its entirety, and I'll try and report back to you. But just like my discussion with Mr. Denisale a couple of weeks ago, there's a lot going on in the world with hydrogen. And the rest of the show, I want to talk a little bit about why that is, because it's really pretty complicated and fascinating at the same time. Um, if you think about some of my shows that I've done in the recent past that talked about critical thinking or risk analysis, you realize that one of the things that I like to do is dig a lot deeper than just the surface when I get into studying something or being part of something or backing a certain endeavor or a certain candidate or anything like that. I like to do my homework. And I've been seeing a lot of email lately about how hydrogen is starting to accelerate and become commonplace in the energy world, in the grid and in transportation, even in aviation and heavy haul trucking and trains and things like that. Things that were talked about for many, many, many years and just never seemed to take hold, but they're taking hold now. But why? And so today I want to talk a little bit about some of the interesting things that are going on in the world that don't seem to have any connection to hydrogen, but they're actually helping precipitate this move towards hydrogen energy storage and hydrogen technology. As you know, I kind of refer to old Chinese things from time to time, like that man over my shoulder on the screen. It looks like over my left shoulder. And there's one old Chinese saying that says the butterfly in Beijing is connected to the tornado in Kansas. And that may seem kind of outlandish and it may seem kind of weird, but the point is that there are so many connections across the world. I think that it's been described as less than 3 degrees of separation between any human being on the planet. There are so many things that happen around the world that don't seem to be connected, but if you dig deep enough, you start to see the connections and you start to understand why things happen. So why is hydrogen starting to take off? Why are those things happening? Well, I'd say very few people would have predicted that the price of a barrel of oil would literally go into the negative dollars as it has this year. And what caused that? That was caused by Russia and OPEC basically trying to compete with each other and actually kind of uh, damaged the US by dropping oil prices so much that all the recent investment that the US has made in fracking and oil production, local oil production, that they would literally underprice the US so badly that the US would be totally devastated by that happening. They would be we'd have companies going bankrupt because they couldn't match the oil prices that OPEC and Russia were putting out there for natural gas in particular, but also oil. In other words, it looked like it could have even been a worldwide attempt to undermine the US energy sector and crush it, make it go bankrupt and cause all kinds of economic hardship in the US. And then what happens? The coronavirus hits. And all of a sudden, nobody's traveling anymore. There's no airplanes flying. There's few cars going. There's still trucks driving around and trains. But look, basically demand for oil worldwide, not just in the US, but worldwide, has suddenly shut back. And what you have right now is such a huge glut of oil, so much surplus of oil, that even the low prices of OPEC and Russia that they were trying to use as a damaging effect for the US is now like not enough to control the free fall of oil on the open market. And OPEC and Russia are starting to squirm and realize that they may have just killed themselves. So as we think about what's going on in the entire energy market, there's a lot happening. So oil and gas, when you look at the supply and demand part of it, has caused a big, huge immediate impact, unpredicted. And solar and wind have predictably gotten cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and more plentiful and more reliable and more ubiquitous. They're, in Hawaii, you can hardly find a rooftop in my neighborhood that doesn't have solar on it. It's happening all over. And the state of Hawaii per capita probably has more rooftop solar than any other state. You see people getting into solar. You see electric companies getting into commercial level solar. You see private companies getting into power purchase agreements with utility companies and selling them wind power and solar power at a fixed rate that is stabilizing their economies and keeping their businesses going indefinitely. And when you're a business and you're trying to make a profit over a certain amount of time, and you've got a certain business model that got targets on it that you have to meet, guess what? Solar and wind are meeting them because the price of the equipment is dropping and the price of operating it is getting cheaper and cheaper. So you have on the one side, the fossil fuel side dropping off, and on the other side, the solar and wind and even to a small degree, um, the nuclear power side and hydroelectric side holding their own and being competitive. But there's more and more pieces to this puzzle. And what I'd like to do now, I don't know if Eric can react this fast, but I'd like to take a quick break. And when we come back, I'd like to kind of focus on coal and the role that it plays in this whole picture, because I think you'll find it fascinating. So if we can take a quick break here, we'll be back in 60 seconds, and I'll start talking about some of the other factors that are playing into a rather dynamic energy market and bringing hydrogen to its day. So back to Stan Energy Man here on ThinkTech Hawaii, and as I promised, I'm going to talk a little bit about coal and some of the other kind of like outliers that you probably don't think about when you think about global energy and clean energy and the impact of what it means for hydrogen. But other than the fact that around the world, if you look at any of the trade magazines or any of the energy sector publications, you'll start to see that countries around the world are actually stepping out in hydrogen. And I can tell you from a conference call I had with several university participants and one gas company down in Australia this week, that between Australia and Japan and Korea and European Union, there are huge moves going on in hydrogen. So what could be driving some of this stuff? Well, first of all, started talking about solar and wind. And there's an interesting factor that a lot of people don't think about with solar and wind They think that you can just throw a bunch of solar panels up or put a bunch of wind power turbines up, and they just keep making electricity and you just keep using it and you're good to go. Unfortunately, when you put it on a grid, it's not that easy because you have something called instability. You have times when the solar and the wind are making way too much energy to be used, and the grid can't handle it, so they literally shut it off. And then it gets wasted. All that energy gets wasted. And then again at night, happens to be a fairly regular activity. The sun goes down, it gets dark, and the solar panels don't work. That's fairly predictable. So what do you do when your solar panels aren't working and the wind power is not enough to take care of your nighttime loads, especially when you're in an area that has industry that runs 24 hours a day or big 24-hour warehouses and stuff. And that's where energy storage comes in. So when you think of energy storage, most people think of batteries, and batteries are great. Batteries are awesome for helping stabilize loads and for short-term energy storage. But batteries are also really expensive. They're really, really expensive. And the current best technology for batteries, lithium, cobalt, a lot of the materials are mined outside the US where we don't have control of the resources, and they're usually mined by kids or with environmental issues that normally we as Americans would never let happen in our country. And yet we're okay with letting some other country abuse their people and abuse their environment to give us what we want. And I personally have a problem with that. So what you need is a good way to store energy that's environmentally friendly, that's safe, that's there when you need it. It gives you the long time duration and is cost effective. And that's hydrogen. Hydrogen is non-toxic. It can be compressed and stored. It can be turned into ammonia and stored as a liquid. It can be turned into liquid hydrogen and stored as liquid. It's very powerful, but it's very safe. We handle ammonia and liquid hydrogen all the time and have for decades with very, very few incidents reported in the news or anywhere else where it's a safety issue. The industry is very used to handling both liquid hydrogen and ammonia for fertilizers and everything else. So whenever whenever you use solar and wind on a grid, you have to be able to store all that extra energy or you're throwing it away. And you also have to be able to stabilize your grid. And there's another factor in making hydrogen that helps in that respect. When you have an electrolyzer taking water and turning it into hydrogen and oxygen, it draws power. In other words, it's a load on your grid. So at the same time that you're producing too much solar power, um, you can actually use those electrolyzers also as a load on the rest of your grid to use electricity that maybe someplace else would be curtailed or thrown away. So making hydrogen can actually help make the grid more stable when you incorporate it into your mix. So what are some of the other things that are tied to this? Well, wind and solar tend to fit into what we call distributed generation. In other words, you have a lot of solar and a lot of wind in a local area, and you can use it right there. You don't have to run big, long transmission lines for hundreds of miles to get it to where you need it. You can actually, in a residential area, put enough solar on the roofs of the houses to pretty much run all the electricity in the neighborhood. So you don't need to even run power lines to it. You can have your backup power in a backup fuel cell generator. You can do things like microgrids. And all this is much better because microgrids are sustainable, they're clean, and they're survivable. And they're also cost effective. So solar and wind are great on the grid for distribution, and they can also use the hydrogen in transportation. But there's another factor that's making hydrogen more viable on a large scale right now that most people aren't thinking about. And believe it or not, it's coal. Yeah, coal. Here in Hawaii, we even have a coal burning power plant in the state of Hawaii that's scheduled for decommissioning in the next couple of years. But even Hawaii burns coal to make electricity. Well, I was surprised to learn that about a third of the US burns coal to make electricity. And back in 2000 to 2010, 900 million metric tons of coal were burned every year. to make electricity. And there's three different kinds, basic kinds of coal: high carbon, medium carbon, and low carbon coal. Most of the high carbon coal, which is very desirable and very expensive, is gone. We've already harvested it, we've already used it. The medium grade coal is kind of the favorite of steel production plants and other industrial uses that need carbon. And the low grade of coal is high sulfur, has a lot of issues with burning it and controlling the emissions on when you burn it. So as a result of the low gas prices and the low oil prices, all of a sudden, producing electricity with coal is becoming really, really expensive. So coal is becoming a casualty of the cheap oil and gas prices, something that I don't think too many people predicted. Most people figured that coal would be killed by somebody who was a green tree hugger and got elected president or something. But no, coal is economically being forced into the background. So what happens when you do something like that, when suddenly coal is out of the picture? Well, if you're using natural gas for your power plants and stuff, and at the same time, the international energy market starts putting pressure on those natural gas plants to sell their product cheaper, they start having financial problems. I mean, picture this. Back in President Obama's administration, we started fracking for natural gas and for oil. And we started putting in a lot of pipelines to move that oil and natural gas all over the US. So the companies that got involved in these investments were making huge investments based on the fact that they were going to be selling natural gas and oil at fairly reasonable prices for the next 20 years. And here it is, 5 to 6 years later, and suddenly the price of natural gas and oil has dropped through the bottom. And the companies that made huge investments in fracking and huge investments in pipelines are losing their shirt. They're going bankrupt. So not only is coal starting to drop off the energy scene, natural gas is starting to drop off the energy scene, except for really, really big companies. And the really big companies aren't purchasing any of the small companies that are folding. They're just dying on the vine. But what happens there? I saw one image that really scared me this week of a natural gas company that's in the middle of bankruptcy. And it was an image at night, an infrared image that showed all the methane leaking from that plant into the atmosphere. For those of you that aren't familiar, methane is 14 times more harmful than CO2 when it comes to greenhouse gases. Most scientists will tell you that methane is just incredibly more destructive than CO2. So if you're a climate change person and you don't like CO2, watching a bunch of methane escape into the atmosphere is even more petrifying. But that's what's happening. You have companies that can't even afford to literally shut their own doors and seal up their own equipment because they're in the middle of bankruptcy and they don't have any funds. So now you have coal collapsing because of economics. You have natural gas on some end collapsing and pipelines going unused. And that's causing a huge, huge problem for the industry itself. But as I mentioned before, the Chinese word for chaos was opportunity and um, great peril. Basically, it's the character that represents it. It's like it can be good or it can be really bad. And that's what's happening right now. What's being really bad for coal and really bad for small gas companies is turning out to be a good opportunity for hydrogen, because all these pipelines that are in the ground could carry hydrogen. Now, most of the pipelines are made of steel or other metals, and not all metals can handle hydrogen very well. There's a thing called embrittlement that becomes a factor. But what most people don't realize, unless they understand the technology, is that hydrogen can be put in smaller diameter pipes or tubes that are made of reinforced fiberglass tubing. They can hold the hydrogen at over 2,000 pounds per square inch pressure. So in other words, maybe a 12-inch or a 15-inch or a 20-inch diameter pipe that moves natural gas or oil, you could basically take 40 or 50 tubes, fiber reinforced tubes, and run them through those same pipes without retrenching and everything else. Just open up the valves and start feeding these things through those pipes and get the hydrogen to run hundreds, maybe even thousands of miles across the US through the same pipelines that the natural gas companies are suddenly abandoning, even if they only abandon a couple of them, or the oil companies abandon a couple of them. They can still be used. All the hard work, the trenching, the welding, and all the stuff that you have to do to keep those pipelines operating properly has all been done. It's a sunk cost. And all you have to do to move hydrogen in them is, number one, keep the hydrogen at lower concentration, lower pressure. You might be able to use the pipelines as they are. But at the very worst case, you take very, very inexpensive fiber reinforced tubing, you slide it inside those pipes, and you turn it wherever it needs to turn to go different directions, and you can make that hydrogen be delivered from massive green hydrogen production plants to anywhere in the continental US. So when you really think about energy as a international global market, when you think about not just the grid piece, but the transportation piece, and not just the ground transportation piece, but the maritime transportation piece, and the aviation and even space transportation piece, and you start connecting all the dots, you suddenly begin to see that hydrogen is making more and more sense. Like I've said several times on the show before, I'm very bullish on hydrogen. I'm I'm bullish because I don't normally accept things at face value. I always try and dig deeper and find out what's the catch. I'm one of those guys that doesn't want to have a trick pulled on me, that doesn't want to be made a fool of, that's going to invest my money into something that isn't a good investment. I always try, especially if it has to do with my reputation or my funds, that I do my homework first and I look. And so far, I've been trying to punch holes in the hydrogen economy and the hydrogen technology for about a decade now, and I just can't do it. There's some things like compressing hydrogen that I wish we could do better, but it's certainly not a showstopper. Um, there's other ways to move hydrogen and put hydrogen, like I say, in ammonia or liquid hydrogen to move it, and it still beats other technologies hands down. The number that I've said some occasionally on this show, and that I always say when I'm doing a presentation, is that when it comes to energy density, there is nothing that beats hydrogen. If you look at your typical lead acid battery, it can give you about 50 or so amp hours per kilogram. If you look at nickel cadmium and other batteries, metal batteries, they can give you maybe 80 or 100 amp hours per kilogram. When you look at your lithium batteries, the whole range of them, and there's all different kinds, you can probably get between 200 and 400 amp hours per kilogram on a lithium battery. Hydrogen is 26,000 amp hours per kilogram. Why do you think they use liquid hydrogen to put rockets into orbit? It's because energy density matters. So when it comes to every aspect of hydrogen you could possibly think of, it's tough to beat. It's tough to punch holes in the argument. And when you start comparing it to the global energy economy, and what's happening real time today with the energy transportation slowdown, the energy price wars going on between OPEC and Russia and the US, when you look at the demand side in China and the rest of Asia and India, you start to understand that the butterflies around the world are connected. The things that are happening on one side of the world do make a difference on the other side of the world. Right now, the United States is a little bit behind on hydrogen. Technologically, we're right there with everybody else. But in terms of actually stepping up with policy and with commitment to hydrogen energy storage and hydrogen technology, the US is lagging. And we have an opportunity to step way ahead like America always does with our talent and our creativity and our economic forces that we can bring to bear. And that's what America needs to do. We need to quit fooling around with these so-called experts that are crying and wringing their hands over social injustice and economic inconsistencies or instability and stuff, and all the virus, mongers that are experts telling you when you should wear a mask and not wear a mask, and wait for a virus, wait for a vaccine and not wait for a vaccine. Let's start putting our energy where we really need to, no pun intended, and start looking at hydrogen, and start looking at fixing our grid, start looking at fixing our transportation sector, using what we have at hand. Remember what your mom told you. You don't have to listen to all the experts. Use your brain. That's what it's there for. So until next Tuesday, thanks for putting up with my tirade. Dan Energy Man signing off. Aloha.